"I can't do everything at once," he complained. In France, enthusiasts are lighting bonfires along the Greenwich Meridian, a line 160 miles long. But they tell me here they think the crew will be much too busy to look out for them.
Meanwhile, the Russians have announced new plans for their space program. One idea is to put huge mirrors into orbit to try to reflect sunlight to parts of northern Russia which have hardly any daylight through the winter. Now, there are also plans to build up a massive orbiting research centre which would have people working on board it all the time. The Russians say the centre would boost the number of experiments that they can carry out.
There was a hiccup when the computer link broke down, but the astronauts think they found a way round the problem to save the experiments.
These are the first pictures of Europe's Space Lab in orbit. The shuttle's cargo bay doors are open, revealing the connecting tunnel which leads to the laboratory at the rear of the spacecraft. There was one minor hitch early in the mission. Space Lab's front door refused to budge. It took 4 astronauts to tug open this new era in space exploration.
Welcome to Space Lab.
The module in which the scientists will be working is pressurized, which means they can do their experiments without the cumbersome burden of spacesuits. They've split into 2 shifts to work round the clock. Out of the back window of the lab can be seen those experiments which will be conducted in the vacuum of space. This Dutch radar dish will allow all-weather viewing of the Earth's surface regardless of cloud cover. One astronaut stripped down to his jogging pants and climbed into some elastic bands for what's called the hop and drop experiment. He jumps up and the bands pull him down. This should help them understand space motion sickness. It worked too well for the next astronaut who tried it. He got so dizzy he had to stop the experiment. Altogether, they hope to conduct a total of more than 70 experiments.
In Lebanon, Israel
in Houston are still trying to correct an instrument failure which is threatening 4 major scientific experiments on the shuttle Columbia. But the experts say the other tests in the shuttle's billion-dollar European-built laboratory haven't been hit by the problem. The 6 astroscientists, now on their 3rd day in space, are carrying out 70 experiments, including a number into the causes of space sickness which often affects astronauts. Columbia orbits the Earth 18 times every 24 hours and is now 160 miles above Siberia. That's it from the news desk at the moment. For the sport, over to Richard.
The astronauts on board the European Space Lab have today been trying to make rare metals by melting down different kinds of metal and mixing them together. Scientists hope they'll eventually be able to set up tiny factories in space to produce the rare mixtures. But meanwhile, the astronauts are carrying on with an exhausting series of tests on their own bodies. Newsround space editor Reg Turner reports from Cape Canaveral.
Shock and drop tests, these are called. Jarriet's leg is getting small electric shocks, complicated experiments to study human balance and what causes a man to fall over. And Merbold has been studying sunflower seeds, trying to find out how growing plants know which way is up. The astronauts are giving a running commentary to more than 100 international scientists sitting in what's called POC, the Payload Operations Control Center. There's so much work to be done in space that NASA is now advertising for new astronauts. They've got 77 so far and want to build that number up to 100.
Threatened to hold up the packed program of experiments aboard Columbia's Space Lab has been fixed, and scientists up there and down here say they're delighted with the results so far. On his 2nd working shift in Space Lab, Dr. Ulf Melbold of West Germany was jack of all trades.
The scientists didn't bring any laboratory rats into orbit with them, so for the last few hours, it's the astronauts who've been the subjects of a whole series of experiments, guided by project teams in mission control. This experiment is yet another attempt to understand the causes of space motion sickness. Called the drop and shock experiment, it gauges the effects of weightlessness on spinal reflex and posture.
Okay, we copy, Brian, and just before we lose you, the data really looks nice down here.
The West German astronaut Ulf Merbold has been keeping his hand in with a spot of space gardening, and his efforts with dwarf sunflower seedlings have been a great success. What the scientists want to find out is how plant growth patterns are affected by weightlessness. As well as the scientists on the ground keeping a close watch on the astronauts have been keeping a close eye on the ground. This eye belongs to one of the 6-man crew on board Spacelab, and they were waiting to see how it would react while hot air was pumped into both of his ears with a pair of bellows. The experiment is designed to study the role of the inner ear in controlling human balance, but the warm air almost succeeded in sending the astronaut to sleep.
Astronauts on board the Space Shuttle Columbia have been trying to find out what causes remarkable sights like the Northern Lights. That's the beautiful glow or aurora which can sometimes be seen in the nighttime sky in countries from Scotland northwards. From Cape Canaveral, Newsround space editor Reg Turnell reports.
The astronauts have caused much excitement here with the first man-made aurora. They fired electron beams causing brilliant flashes, the same effect the sun has on Earth's magnetic field. The ghostly signals also lit up the payload bay. But later, the astronauts got very angry with the scientists at Mission Control. Bob Parker, having hot air blown in his ears, shouted at them, "We're only two up here. Make up your minds what you want us to do and get your act together." The scientists apologized for asking the astronauts to do three things at once, and later told them they'd probably get an extra 10th day in space. And Owen Garriott, a keen radio ham, spent an hour of his off-duty time calling up fellow hams in America. He'll be doing the same thing over Britain on Sunday and Monday.
Extended by another day to 10 days in all. It's because the laboratory aboard Columbia and the experiments being carried out are proving to be such a great success. If they do go on for an extra day, Columbia and its 6 crew will be returning to Earth next Thursday. Sport and the third division.
Hello, good evening. Shuttle may stay up another day. We look at the Europeans who are running the experiments from the ground. And the... A reminder of the headlines. Informal... The European Space Lab may stay in orbit for an extra day because work on board is going so well. And on the crew's 4th day in space, the first ever live sound and vision press conference was held between the Space Lab and ground control. Jane Corbin reports from the European Space Agency headquarters at Cologne.
The signals Space Lab sends to Mission Control in Houston are relayed directly to the European Space Agency's operational center here at Cologne in Germany. The Space Lab is ESA's baby, and everyone here, both the scientists and the general public, are watching anxiously to see how well it performs. So far, so good, despite a few minor hitches with rogue computers. The Space Lab team now look perfectly at home in their weightless environment. Today, they've been examining crystal growth and setting up a British physics experiment devised by Kodak. They've also discovered a substance called deuterium in outer space, which may enable scientists to measure pollution levels on Earth and discover just how poisons can escape from the atmosphere. In Cologne, ESA have set up the test version of the Space Lab. Its twin in orbit aboard the shuttle has stood up to the extremes of temperature very well.
Even though we had a couple of minor problems on board, the crew was really able to solve these problems in a relatively short time. And the thing that we've demonstrated is the flexibility of this kind of an approach.
Claude Nicolier is watching every picture that comes in from the shuttle. He's one of 3 European Space Lab scientists specially trained for the missions. Ulf Merbold went up this time, but Nicolier will be on the next trip in 1985. He believes Space Lab has a bright future.
I think that in 5 years' time we'll be starting to build up a space station in space. Hopefully the European countries will contribute to the build-up of a large space station of the free world in a way, using the shuttle to bring to low Earth orbit the elements of this station and then putting them together and then bring scientific experiments on board and performing these experiments not for days, like it is the case now for space lab flights, but for weeks, months, for years.
And more scientists will have a chance to go up there?
Definitely. There will be a lot of people who do not think now they will be able to go into space, and they will go. And the shuttle is offering that possibility to many people who are non-astronauts to go and fly in space.
Today has been International Day at the ESA Center. Representatives from the Space Agency and from NASA have been discussing Space Lab's future with French and German ministers and with United Nations experts. How important is it for Europe to keep up with the space race? I asked ESA's Director General.
Space Lab is a part of manned space flight. We want to do manned space flight. This is the cheapest way we can do it in cooperation with NASA. Therefore, we have designed this high technology laboratory. Without this, Europe would be left alone, behind the Americans, behind the Russians, and so forth. And we would lack, I would say, a spearhead in technology. Now we have it.
Late this afternoon, the first extraterrestrial press conference, a chance for journalists in Houston and Cologne to put their questions to the crew, who seemed anxious to be photographed from interesting, if unconventional, angles. They were asked about the experiments and how they felt about a longer trip.
Okay, our third question is for Owen Garriott. Project officials have been discussing the possibility of adding a day to the mission. And what do you think about it? That sounds like good news to me. If we can do that, why, I think that would ease things all. I'm sure we'll find plenty of things to do in an extra day.
We've just heard that a French engineer who worked on the European Space Agency's Ariane rocket was charged today with spying for the Soviet Union. French intelligence authorities say he's admitted spying for the Russians since 1970.
So successful, it could be extended by a day. The shuttle astronauts have been carrying out a comprehensive program of experiments, but there's been some tension, with the Space Lab crew saying they want ground control to leave them alone to get on with their work.
Space Lab's astronauts today successfully mixed aluminium and zinc in the weightless atmosphere of space to make a new, strong metal alloy. It's something that can't be done here on Earth because of the different densities of the two metals. Scientists say it could open whole new possibilities of metal manufacturing in space. Earlier, the astronauts used their powerful ultraviolet telescope to study stars and galaxies as they orbited the Earth. Yesterday, one of their more spectacular experiments was creating an artificial aurora by igniting argon gas to show how solar energy might be carried into the Earth's atmosphere.
Release of ionized argon gas every 15 seconds.
Just before we come on air. As it happens, we stay in space for the story of the European shuttle. Now, I say European because the current space flight is the first to have a European astronaut, the West German, and a European space laboratory. But also, for the first time ever, the spacemen are going to have direct conversations with radio amateurs, or hams. It's a busy flight, so busy that the spacemen have actually been losing their tempers at times.
Among today's work for the scientists on board were more experiments on the Earth's atmosphere. On the tray of equipment at the rear of the shuttle, there's an electron gun which the scientists have been firing towards our planet. These discharges are being monitored by their colleagues on the ground. They're hoping to find an explanation for the radiation sometimes seen in northern Scotland, known as aurora borealis. Up in the Space Lab, the scientists are working on more than 70 experiments, and this heavy workload has caused one or two tense moments between ground control and the crew.
You guys, please tell us exactly what you want done when, and we'll forget about what else we're doing at the present time.
This afternoon's schedule was just as hectic. The scientists have moved to a series of special tests on rare metals, and they've carried on with the sunflower seedling experiment, seeing how plants grow in the absence of gravity. Tonight, they're resuming work on those familiar experiments on weightlessness in search of a cure for space sickness.
People could see that from the ground.
But for many space fans back on Earth, the most exciting part of the mission comes this weekend. One of the Space Lab's scientists, Dr. Owen Garriott, is an amateur radio enthusiast, and radio hams all over Europe have been eagerly awaiting this weekend's first direct overhead passes by the shuttle so that they can make contact with him. From this Sunday afternoon till late on Monday night, a team of British enthusiasts will be trying to communicate with outer space.
Potter's Bar in Hertfordshire, commuter land and almost a London suburb. Residential, rather ordinary, and little that's unexpected. Good heavens. The aerial turned out to belong to the Radio Society of Great Britain, representing over 35,000 amateur radio enthusiasts. It's all rather professional at Potter's Bar, and they don't like the term radio ham. They intend tracking the space shuttle during its orbits over Britain and speaking to the amateur radio enthusiast on board, Dr. Owen Garriott, a call sign W5LFL. But what else do they do?
Our function in life is to get all the information, to collate it, to broadcast it. We're one of the very few people in the country, apart from the BBC and the IBA, who are actually allowed to broadcast news. Now, normally we do that on a Sunday morning, but from the station here, we've been doing special bulletins every evening this week, and we're doing another one on Sunday. And the point about those is that we've got information coming in on the shuttle all the time from NASA and from our American counterpart, and our job is to do our best to make sure that all the amateurs, all our members, get that information so that they have a very good chance of working the shuttle. This is Golf Bravo 2, Romeo Sierra.
Although the bulletin provides all assistance, most amateurs simply don't have the equipment to communicate with the shuttle. Here, they reckon they're in with a chance.
Well, before the launch, we had some information from NASA on what are called the orbital parameters. In other words, they're the characteristics of the orbit of the spacecraft. Now, next door, we have a computer, and we're able to switch on a program which tells us in real time exactly what's happening. In other words, where it's coming from, how high it is, and all the rest of it. Now, over there, on the other side of the station, we have an antenna system which can rotate in azimuth, and it can also be elevated up and down. Now, we know the angle at which the spacecraft is going to come over the horizon, and we know its speed, and the computer is actually telling us, second by second, which way to point the antennas. So, when we get a pass, the idea is to aim the antenna at the spacecraft and call him.
All right, so you physically track the antenna, as it
Yes,
were. I mean,
that's right.
it actually moves following the shuttle.
That's right.
And what sort of conversation will you have if you make contact with Dr. Garrett?
Well, you see, there's an awful lot of people calling him, and there's not going to be time for an extended natter about how things are up in space. It's really going to be an exchange of call signs, and since it's us, I would imagine Dr. Garrett might find time to give us a few words of greeting, but it's not going to be an extended dialogue by no means.
So this is actually very exciting for you all.
Oh, incredibly, yes.
Is it the biggest thing for amateur radio ever in this country?
It's a giant leap for us, yes, because it's the first time that ordinary, well, fairly ordinary members of the public have been able to speak to an astronaut actually in space. I mean, only presidents of the United States get to do that. Columbia W5LFL, this is GB3RS, Golf Bravo 3.
Today they had a dummy run. Only on Monday morning will they know if it's possible to communicate with an amateur radio enthusiast 150 miles up in space.
W5LFL, this is Golf Bravo 3, Romeo Sierra.
Bob Welling's the reporter there. Now, pupil power might
Scientists
be...
in the Space Shuttle Columbia have successfully mixed aluminium and zinc in a furnace in the European Space Lab. The experiment is possible only in space because of the different densities of the two metals. The scientists' success could lead to further development of special alloys in space. Earlier, the scientists had fired a beam of charged electron particles to measure the speed and direction of the solar winds. Officials at NASA are considering extending the shuttle mission by...
On board the Space Shuttle Columbia, King Hussein talked with spaceman Owen Garriott, who was using a walkie-talkie as the shuttle passed over Jordan. The King said he was happy and excited to talk to him. The conversation came as Columbia's mission was extended by a further day.
The news of a 24-hour extension to the mission comes as a welcome relief for both scientists in the Space Lab and those in mission control. All of them are anxious to get as much data as possible out of Space Lab's first trip into orbit. Despite problems with equipment and the time taken in effecting repairs, the orbiting scientists have been remarkably efficient in getting through their rigorous schedule of experiments. A great deal of versatility is demanded in their laboratory work. From 1 hour to the next, they'll be studying how fluids react in space and then donning contact lens inside a spinning helmet to study the body's adaptation to zero gravity. But they still find time for a spot of sightseeing.
There's a lot of good snow down in the mountains in Oregon. Ski season is fast approaching.
Hey, firm, we'll have to get together on that a little bit after the mission.
Of the Space Lab today and told them, "You're doing a fantastic job. We're proud of you." He was joined in a European space link-up by the West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl and journalists in 6 countries. And ITN's David Chater became the first British journalist to speak to an astronaut in space.
The astronauts on board the Space Shuttle took time off their busy schedule of experiments today to take part in one of the most complex international television link-ups ever attempted. Not only did they speak with President Reagan in Washington, they also had a chat with the West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who was in Athens. Then the journalists had their chance to ask the questions.
From London, this is David Chater from Independent Television News. Greetings from Great Britain.
Could I ask John Young how well his rookie, Ulf Merbold, has been adapting to space and how well the mission has gone?
Ulf and Barn took to this space flight just like ducks to water. They're fully adopted now, and I'll tell you, they really are enjoying it just as much as we all are. It is delightful up here. Time you can look out the window and see, right now we have a continuous sunset. Pretty soon we'll have continuous sun. Before we were getting a couple of sunsets and sunrises every revolution. See the whole, practically the whole Earth. And having a laboratory like this to work in, it's really nice.
The main headline again.
And lab scientists in the shuttle Columbia said they had detected methane for the first time in the upper atmosphere. President Reagan spoke to the crew today and told them, "You're doing a fantastic job. We're proud of you." British journalists joined him in a special satellite link-up.
The astronauts were given a few minutes off from a busy schedule of experiments today to take part in one of the most complex international television link-ups ever attempted. They spoke with President Reagan in Washington, and then, because a West German was aboard an American spacecraft for the first time, they had a word with Chancellor Helmut Kohl in Athens. Then the journalists had their chance to ask their questions.
From London, this is David Chater from Independent Television News. Greetings from Great Britain.
Could I ask John Young how well his rookie, Ulf Merbold, has been adapting to space and how well the mission has gone?
Ulf and Barn took to this space flight just like ducks to water. They're fully adopted now, and I'll tell you, they really are enjoying it just as much as we all are. It is delightful up here. Time you can look out the window and see, right now we have a continuous sunset. Pretty soon we'll have continuous sun. Before we were getting a couple of sunsets and sunrises every revolution. See the whole, practically the whole Earth. And having a laboratory like this to work in, it's really nice.
ITN in London again. Could I ask Dr. Merbold to describe that first moment when he looked down upon the Earth for the first time?
But I can tell you, it is so spectacular and fantastic that it would have been...
And finally, the scientists on the Columbia Space Lab have been given the extra day in space that they wanted.
Mission Control wanted the flight extended to cram in a few more scientific experiments, but the astronauts are determined to use some of that extra time to take their own snapshots of the Earth. Most astronauts spend a great deal of their time in rest periods just looking out of the windows. Here they're getting a view of Bulgaria and Romania. The workload on this mission has been very heavy, and the scientists back on Earth have been delighted with the results. This experiment shows a silicon crystal being heated to melting point on board one of Spacelab's furnaces. The scientists want to know if the weightless conditions of space will allow it to reform without the flaws usually found in the crystal on Earth. Such a flawless crystal would be invaluable to the microchip industry. Some of the experiments may seem very simple. Here, the West German scientist, Dr. Merbold, is mixing oil with...
A British astronaut's first turn to go into space in 1985 on board the space shuttle Columbia. The announcement is due to be made by the Prime Minister on Monday. Meanwhile, the present team of shuttle astronauts are preparing for landing in California tomorrow after the maiden voyage of Spacelab.
This mission is the 9th and longest in the shuttle program so far. The 4 scientists on board have been working grueling 12-hour shifts, but they've been too engrossed with the results they've been getting from their experiments to show any signs of fatigue.
Those temperatures.
They're particularly excited by one medical test, which may have disproved a 77-year-old theory on the inner ear, which won a Nobel Prize at the time. The astronauts have had to endure a vigorous shaking, with warm air being blown into their ears, while a camera was strapped to their heads watching their eye movements. Not all the experiments have proved so successful. This one was looking at how fluids flow in the weightless conditions of space. Instead of gently draining away, bubbles picked up charge from the Perspex container and shot out of the bottom at great speed. The scientists are still trying to puzzle it out, and they're especially interested in why the bubbles formed into conical rather than spherical shapes.
The first British astronaut could go into space in 2 years' time. The Royal Navy want to launch a navigational satellite from the American shuttle in 1985, and our astronaut will be aboard to supervise. The astronauts on the present shuttle have spent their last full day in space finishing off a few remaining experiments.
The Skynet satellite has been designed by Marconi and British Aerospace specifically for a launch on board the American space shuttle. Britain has come under great pressure, though, to use the European Space Agency's rocket Ariane to launch the satellite. But that would mean a major redesigning job, and it now looks certain the satellite will be launched from the cargo bay of the space shuttle, and that a British astronaut will be on board to supervise that launch. A NASA official told ITN the astronaut will be trained both in Britain and the United States. Up in orbit at the moment, Spacelab's maiden voyage is into its last day. The 4 scientists on board have been working grueling 12-hour shifts, but they've been too engrossed with the results they've been getting from their experiments to show any signs of fatigue. They're particularly excited by one medical test which may have disproved a 77-year-old theory on the inner ear, which won a Nobel Prize at the time. The astronauts have had to endure a vigorous shaking with warm air being blown into their ears, while a camera was strapped to their heads watching their eye movements. Not all the experiments have proved so successful. This one was looking at how fluids flow in the weightless conditions of space. Instead of gently draining away, bubbles picked up charge from the Perspex container and shot out of the bottom at great speed. The scientists are still trying to puzzle it out, and they're especially interested in why the bubbles formed into conical rather than spherical shapes. Some of the fluid used, called silicon oil, managed to escape into the interior of the space lab, where it had calmed down enough to be gently prodded without any dire effects.
Hello, good evening. 2 of the 5 on-board computers failed earlier today, and although one is now back on stream, Mission Control decided to delay re-entry to find out what went wrong. The shuttle is now expected to touch down just before midnight. This from David Chater.
The mission commander, John Young, first reported a problem when he fired one of the powerful maneuvering thrusters in the nose of the space shuttle. A huge jolt shook the whole of the spacecraft, equivalent to 19 times the force of gravity, and started the whole of the nose of the craft rocking up and down. There was early speculation that one of the thrusters might have actually exploded. At the same time, one of their main flight control computers broke down. Mission Control laconically described it as heart failure. 5 attempts to restore it also resulted in failure. A second computer went down when they fired the thrusters a second time. They've managed to repair that one, but Mission Control decided to postpone any landing until they could find out what was going wrong. The space shuttle has 5 onboard computers, any one of which can control a landing, so the problem has not yet reached a critical stage. They have enough oxygen, food and fuel aboard the shuttle to last another 3 days yet. The scientists are working on a set of identical computers on the ground to try and track down the problem. At the moment, they still hope to be able to attempt a landing tonight. But within the last hour, one of their 3 navigational units has also failed.
Faults on the flight deck. The shuttle landing is delayed. Good evening. Something has gone wrong with the American space shuttle. The craft, which has been in space for 10 days, was supposed to have landed 5 hours ago. But when the astronauts fired the thrusters to change the shuttle's position in orbit, a computer failed and gave the craft a severe jolt. A second attempt produced the same effect. Now the 6 astronauts are preparing for a landing in just over an hour's time. Here's our science correspondent, James Wilkinson.
The astronauts are now going ahead with preparations for coming out of orbit, even though they haven't yet found out exactly what went wrong. First signs of a problem occurred as the commander, John Young, fired one of the forward thrusters, which should have tilted the nose down gently. Instead, there was a big jolt, and the shuttle is said to have shaken. At this point, one of the shuttle's computers failed. John Young tried another thruster firing. This caused a second computer to fail as well. There were apparently further bumps as other thrusters are thought to have fired. One of the computers has now been mended, but NASA has abandoned attempts to get the other one started again. What they want to know is why the computers failed when the thrusters were fired. There are a total of 38 thrusters on the shuttle, so if 1 or 2 have become unusable, there are plenty of others to take their place. There are 5 computers on board, and the shuttle can land with only 1 of those. there's enough food and fuel for several more days in orbit if it's necessary. What has been a perfect flight so far is turning into a difficult landing.
And we'll bring you any further news and pictures on that story in our late bulletin.